Although I believe organized religion is just another political movement designed to control the masses.
Okay, let's jump into the first question. This question is from Marilyn. I am married to my husband, whom in the last year has had a lot of question about our faith in Christ. He told me that Christianity was created by the Romans to control the masses. Is this true, and how does this stand for us today?
Marilyn, thank you so much for your question, and I'm so encouraged to hear about your husband, that he's had a lot of questions about faith in Christ. That's fantastic. And I would ask him, as a follow-up to what he said to you, ask him why he believes that. Maybe ask him if there's something that you can read to better understand why he accepts that position. And maybe that would even lead to an opportunity for you to ask him if he'd be willing to consider a different perspective. Maybe you can read a book together on this topic. That could be a fantastic open door as you continue to explore faith together. I'm really encouraged to hear that you're having that interaction as a married couple. It may be that your husband came across a book titled Caesar's Messiah. It's a 2005 book by Joseph Atwill. And in that book, he argues that the New Testament Gospels were really made up by Roman emperors and by the scholars who were connected to and controlled by Roman emperors. He sees it as wartime propaganda. He thinks that the primary purpose of the Gospels was really from the Roman side to create a religion that would limit the spread of Judaism. And he thinks that's why we find the pacifist leanings of Jesus in the Gospels, and also why Jesus says things like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I have some questions about that approach. Joe, I know you do as well. I mean, what are your initial reactions to that type of approach?
Yeah, I mean, that one's an interesting idea to me, in part just because in terms of the timeline of history, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense, because by the time that you have Roman emperors really, coming to faith in Christianity or appropriating Christianity within the Roman Empire, you're really talking about Constantine, and that's the 4th century. But the issue we have here is that actually the most significant resistance that the Romans ever had from the Jews was really back in the 1st century. Right. And they've already utterly crushed them by this point. I mean, it's around AD 70 that the Romans have already gone in and crushed the Jews. They've destroyed Jerusalem. There isn't really much of a resistance left to talk about. So this idea that the Romans are responding to this great movement within Judaism, it's really just several centuries too late, for starters. There's also just a bunch of other problems with that in terms of our understanding of how the canon comes to be formed, when that takes place, when the scriptures of Christianity are put together. And we're going to talk about this more in the second question of our episode, but I would say that has already come to pass before Constantine has come into power and before the Romans are really getting involved within Christianity. It's also a bit problematic to say that the Christian faith is a way of just suppressing opposition to government and having people live peacefully. Christians do, in general, make great citizens because we are part of a peaceful religion, but we're still a religion that, as Peter says in Acts chapter 5, right. We don't obey men but God. Ultimately, we're under the authority of God, and so that's problematic for any Roman emperor who wants to be worshipped as God himself, as we see throughout the early history of Christianity for the first several centuries. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a couple of seconds' time. But I think that thesis is actually riddled with problems.
Yeah, those are good points. And I think if Roman emperors did want at some point to win over Jewish support, you could have gotten that just by giving freedom of religion, to construct a huge conspiracy of constructing an entire religion based on the idea of a coming Messiah. That seems to me a much more difficult way to go about getting that support than to just give the freedom of religion that the Jewish people desired. I also have a hard time thinking of Roman emperors being the ones to intentionally create a religion which was very exclusive and would exclude their own deity. Right. And so when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, it's quite an exclusive claim. Right. And it's difficult to think of Roman emperors saying, yes, I want my own deity to be undermined in light of the exclusive nature of Jesus' deity. So this idea, Marilyn, it hasn't been received very well. Two biblical scholars, Robert Price he speaks of Atwill's book, and he says that Atwill gives himself license to indulge in the most outrageous display of parallelomania ever seen.
Good word. I'm not sure what that
Very good
means,
word.
but
I
I
did
like
not
it.
think I'd get that coming out of my mouth smoothly. And then biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, who many will know, again, a non-believer, says, I know sophomores in college who could rip this to shreds.
Yeah.
And he points out that Atwill does not have training in any relevant field. So I would take this as only a starting point in your consideration. Read the book. If this is the book that your husband's referring to, read it in detail. Don't just take it on the authority of others who have questioned it, but maybe the fact that others who know a lot about these subject matters have questioned it and questioned it quite severely could be enough at least to reopen the question for your husband and maybe start an exploration together about whether this is a true position or whether we have to look in a different direction.
Yeah. And let's just look at some of the fundamental facts of history here. I mean, as your starting point, the least disputed fact about Jesus is that he's put to death on a Roman cross by a Roman proconsul called Pontius Pilate. So for a starting point, it's hard to think of the Romans as creating Christianity when at the very beginning, it starts out in a sense in opposition to Christianity. And we know that that fact comes from Tacitus, a Roman historian, so this is recording his own history and saying that Christ was put to death by those in Roman power. We have similar sources from Pliny the Younger, who's writing to the Emperor Trajan in the sort of 2nd century, when he basically says, I've been interrogating Christians, and if they refuse to denounce their faith by the 3rd time, then I order them to be executed. And then we have a long history of Christian martyrdom under Rome. Now, at times it's more intentional than others over the next several centuries, but there are specific periods of history where there's a very intentional policy of persecution led by the Roman emperors, whether it's Decius around 250 AD or whether it's Valerian just about a decade later, deliberately targeting Christians. And then if they won't renounce their faith, they're either exiled, they go into forced labor, or they die in horrible, torturous ways. And this carries on for, all the way to AD 303. You have Diocletian, who again goes around destroying churches, destroying Christian texts. And this goes all the way up to AD 313 when you have the Edict of Milan. And that's when Constantine comes onto the scene. And so there's a long history of battling within the Roman Empire against Christians precisely because they don't like the message of Christianity, which is essentially, as Vince has said, the worshipping of Jesus as the only true God and a refusal to bow down and worship Roman gods, including often the emperor himself, who they would not worship. And so you have that history. You also have the earliest apologists, people like Justin Martyr, who, in his very first apology that he wrote, he's actually writing to the Roman emperor and trying to explain what Christianity is about, because they seem to have misunderstood it. So he's trying to dispel myths, but he's also protesting unjust persecution of Christians. And in Justin's own words, he says, you're able to kill us, but not to hurt us. Basically, your persecution will not stop us. So actually, there's a strong history of being countercultural within Christianity against those in power when that power isn't representative of who God is and what, as Christians, we're called to believe.
Sometimes people think that if Constantine exerted this type of influence, it must have been at the Council of Nicaea. Yeah. But the history seems to indicate that although Constantine may have been present, he wasn't directing or chairing, in a sense, that council. Athanasius speaks of Bishop Osius of Cordoba as chairing that council, and then when there are lists of those who were present, Bishop Osius is listed first as well, also implying that. So if you were going to make up the Christian religion, you would have had to have had control over the corpus of writings that was going to direct it. And it doesn't look like Constantine had that control at the Council of Nicaea. And of course, the Council of Nicaea is not a council about putting together the canon in the first place, right? It's about certain beliefs of Arius and how we should understand the divinity of the Son of God, of Jesus. But it's not a council about constructing the canon, and that's what Constantine would have had control over if he was really going to direct the emergence of this religion in the way that some have claimed.
It could be possible, Marilyn, that maybe some of the the ideas behind your husband's thinking here came. Another place it could have come from is the Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown, who also talks about Constantine, and he's the one who sort of inserts into popular culture this idea that Constantine is the one who basically manipulates Christianity as a power play. But actually, when you really get into the history here, as Vince has just said, far from it being the case that Constantine is taking control of the Christian faith, it's more like, despite centuries of persecution, Christianity just will not be put out. And no matter what they do, it just keeps growing. And so in a way, there's a question mark over whether Constantine's conversion to Christianity is authentic or not. Certain church historians like Eusebius will make the case that it was. Others are more skeptical. But whatever the case, in his own motives or personal motivation, it seems to be more that what's going on is that Christianity has become so widespread across the empire that it's just politically expedient. It just makes sense in terms of holding on to his own power to go with the flow and to have a freedom of religion where Christianity is acknowledged and certain bishops are given positions of political power. That's true, that they have greater power than they ever had at that point onwards. But even having said that, that doesn't mean that Constantine shuts down other faiths. He still has freedom of religion for other beliefs as well, other pagan systems, Roman gods. So it's not like suddenly Christianity is forced upon everybody else. Actually, it's just a more tolerant policy where Christianity is kind of brought to the forefront, but other beliefs are still on the scene as well. So it's just a different picture to the one that's sometimes presented in the sort of Hollywood or popular versions of this story.
Hollywood doesn't always tell the truth.
What?
No, actually,
I wouldn't go that far, but maybe.
Well, that goes to show you that all you have to do to get a book published is be critical of Christianity, and they'll publish anything. So that actually brings up the point. Considering there's a lot of books out there that maybe aren't necessarily intellectually honest, I've got a recommendation. It's called The Story of Christianity. It's by a guy named Gonzalez. He's got 2 volumes. One is on the early church up until the Reformation, and then from the volume 2 is from the Reformation until today. Joe, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, a couple of others that would be helpful. There's one by Alistair McGrath, Historical Theology, which is an introduction to the history of Christian thought. That's very helpful, slightly more academic. Another one that be at a more popular level, but very good, and speaking specifically about the process of canonization and how the books of the Bible come together during this era, is Michael Green's book called The Books the Church Suppressed. And that one is good as well. So yeah, a couple of helpful resources there. I think the other thing, just to say in light of this question, is how does it stand for us today?
Yeah.
And I think it's good for us just to reflect on the fact that, because you often hear this rumor that religion is about controlling the people or forcing people to believe certain things or hold certain political positions. But it's just worth remembering that Christianity doesn't belong to a political party. And actually, we're worshipping a God who is the king of the universe and not a particular citizen of a particular nation. In fact, as Christians, we're told our citizenship is in heaven, and we deeply care about the world. We deeply care about politics because we're called to love people. Right. And that's one of the processes through which we do. But it's never intended to be a power play. And it's dangerous to try and take hold of Christianity and make it conform to a particular political position or a particular regime or a particular party or government, because God will not submit to human institutions. And, the reality is throughout history and up until today as well, and very often it's precisely because of the Christian views you hold that rather than being in a position of power to manipulate people, more often than not, you're in the persecuted minority. Yeah. And you can, you only need to go to Open Doors and check out their resources online just to see the unbelievable amount of persecution taking place in the world today of Christian believers, whether we're talking about the Middle East and whether we're talking about Asia, North Korea, increasingly in India today, we're seeing the same thing going on, Syria, and the treatment of both the Yazidi and Christians who live there. And so time and again, you're seeing Christians being persecuted. In fact, people talk about it as one of the underreported and most overlooked crimes within humanity of this generation, that people are really ignoring it in a way that they didn't used to.
Right.
But persecution is actually extreme for many Christians around the world. We're super blessed to live in a culture right now where my life isn't really endangered for being a Christian. But, also there's no guarantee that things stay that way forever. You don't know. You just don't know what is going to come down the line. But the point is, this isn't about holding political power over other people, but actually it's about giving your life to God and saying, do with me what you will. I want to live by your laws. And if that brings me into conflict with another rule, another way of doing things, then actually, God, I'm saying yes to you first.
Yeah. All you have to do is just interact with like our global speaking team, and they can tell you how completely untrue this kind of perspective is.